Well, if I were to ask you this morning, why do you love God? There might be a lot of different answers. Or maybe if you're listening online or you're here and I don't know your heart, but maybe you're just seeking God or whatever the case is. What is attractive about maybe some things we've talked about with this God in the Bible? Maybe you've been listening for quite a while online or something like that. What would you answer? I think many of our answers might be God's grace. I'm thankful for God's grace. That's true. I'm so thankful for his mercy. He doesn't give me what I deserve. You might say his friendship, right? Those are all great qualities, and those are all true, by the way. I'm not diminishing those by any means. I think there's a quality, though, that might not come to your mind right away. That might not be the first thing that you want to appreciate about God. His holiness. Now, I understand it's kind of, if you were to say, hey, God is holy, of all those characteristics, that one's hardly mentioned as our favorite. It's not the one that we, if you get together with a group of people, you're praising and worshiping God or praying to him, because sometimes like we do in our nights of prayer. I know it has been mentioned, holiness, but it's probably not the first one we mention. God's holiness, I'm thankful for his holiness. God's holiness tends to make us cringe today. It's a seemingly unattractive quality of God. It's not one that we like to talk about. It's one that we like to sweep under the rug. And there might be a lot of reasons for that. I want you to think about what might be some of the reasons why we don't love God's holiness. I think maybe for some, the idea of God's holiness is just boring. Like, okay, if God's holy, that's just putting a wet blanket on everything fun that I ever wanted to do. And it just takes away everything. Maybe there might be some who say they just don't like being told what to do. And because God is holy, that means there's someone that they have to give an account to, and we don't want to be told what to do. We want to tell ourselves what to do. No one should be able to reign over our lives. We like being the boss of ourselves. Perhaps some of you think that you should be able to determine what's holy and what's not, what's right and wrong. There might be some of you who sit there and say, nobody can understand my experiences. No one can understand what I've gone through. How could someone ever tell me what is wrong and right? Or maybe some of you out there think that right and wrong are merely constructs that we've created to just help us live a better life. It's just basically, it's something out there that we do so that we can basically just not hurt somebody else, but we can just live the life that we want to live. And so at that point, we might think that no one should decide what's holy at the exclusion of something else. No one else should be able to decide we should be able to decide for ourselves what's best. And on top of that, holiness has a certain exclusivity, doesn't it? If you're saying something is holy, you're saying something else is not holy. We don't like statements of exclusion. We want all philosophies and thoughts and ideas to come to the table. And for that reason and many more, I think probably the most important reason, maybe the reason why we don't like God's holiness, is probably because we know that deep down we fall short of his holiness. We don't want to deal with that. We don't want to deal with the consequences of what that means. And friends, for that reason and many more, when we mention God's holiness, it's one of those traits that we like to say, let's just put this away. It's kind of those things that when somebody comes to your church, we're going to mention the God's love, his grace, and all those great things. The holiness, we're just going to put that in the back pocket and maybe bring it up every once in a while. But it's not going to be the one that we're going to bring to the forefront, right? It's not going to be the one that we actually like to talk about because, it's just awkward. People don't like it. It makes them feel awkward, so we ignore it. If you're a Christian, you might be embarrassed by it and explain it away because you know how others will be repulsed by it. Or if you're a non-Christian today, first of all, if you are a non-Christian, we're thankful that you're listening to this. And so we welcome you here. But at the same time, maybe you're saying, I just want to explain it a different way instead of what God says about holiness. But here's my question. What if we're all getting it wrong? What if God's holiness is a good thing? And by ignoring it, we're missing out on some of the best things that God has for us. What if God in His holiness is actually far better than ignoring His holiness? What if God's holiness is far better than the lives we try to settle for? What if God's holiness is not something we should be ashamed of talking about, but something that we should relish, something we should be proud of, something that we should talk about? Friends, what if God's holiness is what makes life worth living? Now you look at this passage of Scripture we're going to look at is in Psalm 99. Psalm 99 is where we're going to go. And it's an interesting psalm because it's a unique one. All these are songs that God had given to His people, His covenant people in Israel, and under the Old Covenant. And this one in particular is interesting because it is written to Israel, but it's written really for them to sing to non-Israelites. It's really written as an apologetic, if you will. And it's really written for them to call on the other nations to come and worship their holy God in their temple. And here's the other interesting thing. It is written, or at least it was compiled, during a time, or at least for the people who were in exile. Now you remember what's going on in exile, if you don't remember. Israel had rejected their God, and so therefore, according to the covenant that God had given them, God had brought them into exile. So exile meaning they were taken away from their land. They were among other nations. And here's what's interesting. While they're being captured, this is a song that God wanted them to sing to the other nations, to tell of who their God is, and to explain, to not be ashamed of His holiness. Because what they're going to point out is it is the holiness of God that attracts people to Him. It's the holiness of God that allows us to see Him in the best possible light. And because that's the case, this morning we look at this, and in this passage, this psalm teaches us why this God is worth worshiping and following today, because He's holy. Why is the holiness of God an important trait? That's this morning. Why should you follow our holy God? As we look at this passage, let me just read it all together. We're going to really focus in this morning on verses 1 through 5, and I'd like to pick up on it next week. Just take half. I know that's a little bit, not a lot that we're looking at, but just little bit by little bit in the next 2 weeks. But look with me in Psalm 99. The Lord reigns. Let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is He. The King in His might loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at His footstool. Holy is He. Moses and Aaron were among His priests. Samuel also was among those who called upon His name. They called to the Lord, and He answered them. In the pillar of cloud He spoke to them. They kept His testimonies and the statutes that He gave them. O Lord our God, You answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoings. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at His holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. I love this passage. And for that reason, as I was studying it, I was going to take it in one gulp here, and just realized I think it's good to slow down and just dwell on God's holiness for a couple weeks. If that's okay with you? And if not, too bad. But you look at this passage of Scripture. We want to look here at why you should follow our holy God. Why follow a God that's holy? In this first passage that you look at in verses 1 through 3, the first reason is this: because our holy God reigns over all. Now can you buckle up, stay with me? This is going to rub you the wrong way. I'm telling you right now. I'm telling you right now, this is probably going to rub us the wrong way. But it's good. It's good for you. And so you look at this passage, the God of the Bible is the only divine king that has the right to rule over all. All the universe falls under His dominion. And that's what we see in these first 3 verses. The psalmist starts off with a bang here. He talks about the glory of God. Let the Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. Do you see that His dominion, where His dominion stretches? Over all the peoples. He's not just talking about Israel. He's talking about all the nations, all the ethnicities, all the people. And then it's not just the people, but the whole of creation, all of the earth. And so you look at this passage, what he's pointing out is that his greatness is stretching over all, and that his dominion is over everything. Even here today now, God is an authority over everyone and everything. And what's the response when we see this God and his greatness? He goes on to say, let the peoples tremble, and then let the earth quake. What's the proper response? What is it? If we saw God in his greatness, in his holiness, what would the reaction be? Shaking to the core. The earth shaking, trembling. And it's trying to show you that this divine king is not only has authority, but he's authoritatively strong. He's greater than your mind can comprehend. He is above and beyond you. That's why it uses this terminology, he sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Those cherubim are these, you might call them otherworldly angelic creatures. The way they're described, cherubim and seraphim in the Bible, are ways that we can't really wrap our minds around. You look at the living creatures around the throne. These otherworldly creatures, he's beyond this realm. You could call it the transcendence of God, is what it's referring to. And even those pure angelic creatures, as they are around the throne, even though they're pure, they have to hide their face. They have to hide everything. Because God is that holy. And so I want you to just imagine with me, not only does God rule and reign, but the greatness would put us on our knees. It's reminiscent, if you remember, in Isaiah 6. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne. Uzziah was, in an earthly sense, one of the greatest kings that Israel had had. But in his pride, he rejected God, and eventually God struck him with leprosy. But all the people looked at Uzziah's reign as this is like the best. Think of your favorite president of all time. And think of Uzziah as higher and better. He did greater things for Israel. He was a strong king. And he dies. And we're all sitting there. It's like when the guy that you really liked gets out of office. Oh, what are we going to do now? And yet at that moment, that's when God gives Isaiah a vision of who is really on the throne. The divine king. And who is that? It's God. He is enthroned in the temple. He's in Israel. He is the one. And he says that he is high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim, these otherworldly creatures. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and 2 he covered his feet, and 2 he flew. And they all called, and one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. That holy, holy, holy is, it's kind of this idea that we're proclaiming it higher and higher and higher and higher. That's what this psalm does as well. You see it 3 times, by the way. It's reminiscent. But then also, the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. They couldn't even see the glory of God directly because God couldn't allow that. So the smoke was in the temple. So do you see what's going on here? He sees a glimpse of the divine king, and the whole earth is trembling. And what is Isaiah's natural response? Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Friends, it's hard to imagine seeing this. We've never experienced that firsthand. But this God, you need to know today, is great, holy, and the divine authority in all of life. And to stand before him in your sinfulness, you couldn't. It's a reminder of, in this passage, that's why it comes in the verse 3, let them praise your great and awesome name. That awesome is a word we use a lot for great. Hey, that's awesome. It's really good. You're awesome. Awesome is the awe-filling power of God. This in some translations says awful. Awful meaning like it's full of awe. Holy is he. Now, I want to pause here and let you understand something before we go any further. It's a crucial point. Understand this morning, that God is the supreme king over all the universe. And because he is king, that means we are answerable to him, whether we recognize it or not, and whether we know it or not. Now let's say today I wanted to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to start my own country. I don't like the laws of the United States anymore. So today I'm sectioning off the land that we own, and we're just going to have our own nation, the new nation of Community Bible Baptist Church. This is a new nation. And I decide I'm not going to follow the laws of the country. I'm not going to pay them taxes that they want from us. And you guys can join. You can bring tents into this little area. You can live here with us. We're going to be our own country. What's going to happen? The United States is going to take kindly to that, right? Why? Because we are in their boundaries. We're in the boundaries of the United States. And it doesn't matter if I say that I'm a country. It doesn't matter if I say that I'm not going to follow the laws. I'm under some authority whether I like it or know it or not. And friends, here's the thing that this passage is teaching us. All the earth is under the divine, awesome authority of God. Whether you know it or not, whether you recognize it or not. You can't say, and a lot of us want to say to ourselves, nobody tells me what to do. Friends, I say this not out of relishing it or beating you up. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. There is a God of the universe. And so if you're a non-Christian listening to here, let me just say, I am glad you're listening. You're welcome in our church, even if you do not believe what I'm talking about today. But I hope you understand this morning that you're not supreme king over all. You're not. There is someone who reigns over you, and there's someone that you are accountable to. And that reason alone is the reason why we worship him. But if you are a Christian today, perhaps you're listening and you're like, yeah, go get them. Go get those atheists. Go get those agnostics. Go get those non-Christians. Get them, because you're right. They need to know that. Friends, I think it's true that others need to know that. I think Christians need to know that just as much. Because the truth is, sometimes we don't treat God like the divine king of our life. And we're not saying he is, whether we recognize it or not. We're not treating him that way. In fact, we treat him more like what we would call a constitutional monarchy. You know, the British government today has a constitutional monarchy. The monarchy is bound by the Constitution. So essentially, the monarchy doesn't have any power. They can't tell anybody what to do. They're more of a figurehead. They're ambassadors for the nation, essentially. They're people that you can look to and say, yeah, that's what unites us. This person is a figurehead. This is somebody that we appreciate. Maybe it's somebody who can influence you, but they can't tell you what to do. And friends, it's sad to say that I think there are many Christians that treat God more like a figurehead God than they do like the God who reigns over their life. Like essentially what we say to ourselves is, hey, I love God. He's my king. He's kind of my representative. I can tell other people. Like, yeah, I can say that he is my figurehead God, essentially. He's my leader. But you have no intention of really listening to what he says. Really, you rule your own life. And friends, let me tell you, as a believer, especially remember that you are under a divine authority. And friends, that is a good thing. But I want you to see, too, this is amazing. Look at verse 2. It says, the Lord is great in where? In Zion. So he's talking to the peoples, and he says that the Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. So try to grasp what he's saying here. He's talking, and he's saying all the peoples, all the nations of the world, everything's under his dominion. But that God is the God of Israel. Zion is the Temple Mount. It's the place where God showed his presence on earth. It's the temple area. And then you see that throughout this passage. It talks about the footstool, worship at his footstool, meaning that's the Ark of the Covenant, the place where God's feet dwelled on earth. And then it goes on to talk about worship at his holy mountain. Let me just tell you what he's saying. They're trying to say this. Our God is exclusively God. Not your gods. Our God is God. Our God is God over everything. And as you look at this, it's really making a statement of not just exclusivity, but inclusivity. He's saying, our God is God over all, and you can come worship him too. We want you to come. They're claiming that this God of the universe is their God. And friends, that's what we need to see here this morning. This God is exclusively the King. And I know that's contrary to many popular opinions today. But there is no other way but his. There's no other holiness but his. There's no other reign but his. No other gods, systems, religions, or philosophies reign. There is only one king. Now, I know there's a lot of popular opinions today. You get in some places, some people like to say, well, there are many roads to God, or there are many roads up the mountain. In other words, there might be people who believe different things, but eventually we all get to the same place. The Bible does not teach that. You need to understand it. You need to understand that the God of the Bible teaches us that there is no other way. And some people say, well, okay, but aren't there just other names for God? It's just one God, but some call him Buddha, some call him Yahweh, some people call him Muhammad, some people call him Jesus. There's just it's just a different way of calling him different things. And friends, I'm telling you, the God of the Bible says no one else's God is legitimate. And I get why you'd want to say that. Nobody wants to be the guy that makes it awkward and toss to tell somebody they're wrong. I understand that. And I understand that a lot of people it's just hard to have these claims of exclusivity in the world we live today. It rubs people the wrong way. But the God of the Bible makes it clear that he alone is God. He is exclusively God. Now let's say this morning that I came to my wife and I brought a different woman into the house every night, and I said, honey, they're female just like you. So it's okay. They can be a part of my life just as much as anybody else. What do you think she's going to do? I'm going to be not just sleeping on the couch, I'm going to be sleeping on the street. Right? Because your marriage is exclusive. And it should be. But friends, the same thing goes with God. He is exclusively God. You can't say, well, yeah, you can have these other people in your life. No, he's saying, no, I am the one God. I am exclusively the one. And just because there's some people that have similar characteristics doesn't mean that they're actually God. I am exclusively God. But understand what this also means is he's also inclusively God. See, he doesn't say, you can only worship me if you're a type of race or gender or something like that. He calls all people to himself. This exclusive God doesn't say that no one can worship him. He says, I want all to worship this temple. I've provided a way for all to worship me in my temple. And he's referring here to the sacrificial system that we know now today is through this person and work of Jesus Christ that he has done, that he has sacrificed himself once for all sin. And so today, this is what God calls us to do. He's an inclusive God that says, come worship me through what my son has done so you can be made right with me. You can stand holy in my presence, and you can worship this good, holy God that reigns over all. Friends, today, God is God. And he is God over all, and that alone should be a reason to worship him. But it doesn't stop there. Just bear with me. One more point here today. Why should you follow our holy God? Well, secondly, because our God acts according to his holy character. Now, friends, it's one thing if there is a sovereign ruler and has dominion over everything. But if that sovereign ruler is a bad king, we're in trouble. I mean, that's always been the way it is. A lot of people like to bash dictators, and I'm not a fan of dictatorships. I'm glad I live in the USA, okay? But throughout the centuries, when they had a complete dictator or a monarch or something like that, if the monarch was good, the people were good. If the monarch was bad, things didn't go so well. Now, listen, this is basically saying that God reigns over all. And if he reigns over all, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what we're going to see what we see in verses 4 and 5 is it is a great thing. It is a perfect thing. Because you look in this passage, it says, the king in his might loves what? Loves justice. This king with all the power that he has, this king with all the dominion that he has, what does he love? Justice. It goes on, you have established equity. So this king, with his might and with his control, what does he do with that might? He doesn't just crush people. But it says that he acts only in justice. Not only that, but this means that this God, with his power, acts with love and justice, always shaping his actions. And because of his holy character, this God can be trusted to always act in perfect justice. And that's what he's done since the beginning. It says that he has established equity. In other words, he's established what is fair, what is good, what is right, what is wrong. And this is true of how he's established the world in ancient past. Friends, you all have a law written on your hearts. You know good and evil. He's given us all a conscience. And yes, we can ignore that conscience, but he's done something that has shown us that there is a right, there is a wrong. Friends, we've all felt guilty before. We've all wanted to stand up against injustice. Why is that? Because the holy God of the universe has established equity in this universe. He's established what is right and wrong. And I know that there are some people who protest that idea. There are some people, you might say, who do not, you might say today that you don't have to believe in God in order to do what's right, just, and moral. In fact, you might take pride. You might take pride in yourself seeking to do what is right and not having any religious motivation to do so. In fact, you might even show more moral outrage over abuses of injustice than many of your Christian friends do, if you're listening. And you're saying, hey, I don't believe in God, but I still get angry over right and wrong. Let me tell it, let me put it to you like this. It's true that you can do what is right and not believe in God. But it will not be because you do not believe in God. Because friends, if we are all just happen to be here, if we happen to be created, if we happen to just be the lowest life form that happened to rise to the top, then what is morality but just some kind of social contract that doesn't really mean anything? Why get mad over when bad things happen? It really doesn't really truly matter. Why get angry over when a policeman might put his knee over somebody else and kill them? Why get outraged over it? Why get outraged over sex trafficking? Why get angry over terrorist attacks in other nations? Why should we get angry at all? But friends, I think you know deep down there is an outrage. And it can only be described as something that was set there before you. That someone else has established equity in the universe. And so I want to ask you this morning, as you look at this, have you considered that perhaps what is right and just can only truly be established by a righteous and just God of the universe? And have you considered that your sense of right and wrong and your moral outrage might be evidence that this God is holy and has sought to establish a world where you can be steered towards what is good and steered away from what is wrong and evil? See, God has done that. And this is the good God that we have. This is why he's worth worshiping. He has given you a law in your heart and your mind to walk in his way. But it's not just the way that God has established in the past. It's the way that he works today. As you look at this, the psalmist gives an example of how the Lord has dealt and executed justice today. It says in verse 4, the king in his might loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. It's Jacob. He's talking about Israel. So he's basically saying, here's an example of how God has now, today, in their world, acted out righteously. Look at the nation of Israel. Now, obviously, he established law with them, and we'll get to that a little bit more next week. But it goes beyond that. It's saying that his sovereign rule over Israel shows that he is just. And every time what he has done, he has always acted in holiness. In his holiness, God had always acted. He's always done what he has said. He has always hated evil and warned people against it. And even their current exile was an example of how this God had dealt righteously with his people. See, the people of the world had it wrong. They had it opposite. They had a misunderstanding. They had thought that because Israel's God, that they had conquered Israel, that means that their gods that conquered Israel's God was the greater gods. But Israel's saying, no, that's not the case. The case is actually, you look at us, you see that God has actually done what he said he would do. He's done what he's promised to do to us because we've rejected him. He is acting in a holy way in Israel. It's reminiscent of what God warned them about in Deuteronomy 29, 24 through 25. All the nations will say, why has the Lord done this to the land? He's saying, after I bring you into exile, after I bring you these things when you reject me, he says, they will also ask what caused the heat of his great anger. And then the people will say it's because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. See, what the people in exile are saying here is that the fact that they're in exile is not an example that their God does not reign. It's an example that God does what he says he's going to do. That our God is holy. It's a good thing that we're looking at. And friends, even today, this God of the universe is always acting righteously in the world. Friends, that means that your life, God is always acting in fairness. And you might say to me, okay, that's a nice sentiment, Pastor Evan. That's great. But I live in the real world here, okay? I don't think that what God is doing in my life is really fair. It doesn't feel like what God is doing in my life is really just. But I wonder if you just think it's not just and right because you don't understand everything. You don't have the right perspective. You don't see all that's going on. A few years ago, we were at my parents' house, and we would gather together for meals and things like that. And when we gathered together for meals and prayer, sometimes couples will snuggle together, while the prayer is going on. So my brother-in-law, Brian, went up to, he went to hug his wife, basically, while the prayer was going on, and put his arms around her while he did that. And he came to the realization that the person that he had put his arms around was actually my sister-in-law, Laura. See, from behind, my sister-in-law Laura, my sister Joy, who he's married to, actually have the same haircut. So he didn't even have the right perspective of looking at it, and he's snuggling with the wrong person. And that is a horrifying and awkward realization to come to. Friends, I think the reality is sometimes we think, no, what is right is this, and our perspective is completely off. And in fact, what we could be doing is horrifyingly wrong. Because the God of the universe is setting what's right and good and true. Is it possible this morning that your view of what is right and just might be off? Is it possible that you've elevated your view of people that God has created above the Creator himself? Is it possible that you tend to have been affected by what others claim as righteous as opposed to what the true holy character of God declares as righteous? Could it be that what you think is right and good is actually tragically wrong and bad? And friends, is it possible that the way that you look at the angles of this world that you look at are actually wrong? You're a finite human being that doesn't see everything. And so friends, as you look at your life today, is it possible is it possible that what you think is really bad in your life might actually be immeasurably better than you can even imagine? In fact, I heard it said like this. One pastor put it this way. Those that want to say that God is wrong, he doesn't act justly today, look at my life. Of course, why would God do X, Y, and Z if he's really just? Those are the people that never would have planned Good Friday. Because that day, everything seemed to be tragically wrong. But it was immeasurably holy. It was immeasurably good. It was immeasurably right. And it was the way that God was instituting holiness into the world through the person and work of Jesus Christ by making others holy through his sacrifice. So friends, when you look at your life and things don't go the way you planned it, maybe that friendship is just deteriorating, maybe your family is struggling, maybe your sickness has gotten hold of you, and you say, God, why would you ever do this? Remember just this simple phrase. Everything God does is right. Today, in your life, everything God does is right. And he is worth following for that reason. And that's why it ends with telling the nations, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Come join us. Join us in worshiping this God at the Temple Mount. Come join us. And that's kind of the idea here, is he's saying that you see the holiness of God come. It's attractive, it's a good quality. And this would have been majorly attractive. God's holiness would have been a major attraction to the other nations. Why? Because their gods were not holy. They could fly off the handle for no reason at all. They could just play with their people. That's why their sacrifices that the other nations would give to their God, it was less about their holiness and being right with him. It was more about appeasing him and making sure that they got on his good side. Because their gods could go off and get in a bad mood at any moment. That's what they believed about their gods. But here is the God of Israel, and they're saying, our God is perfectly just and holy. He does not change. He doesn't fly off the handle randomly. You can trust what he says. He's a holy God. That would have been immeasurably attractive to these people. He genuinely cared about the world and about them and about what was just and right. And his sacrifices at his footstool were a gracious means to cover their sin, to make them holy. Worshipping this God then was far greater than things that they had ever known. Friends, as you look at the holiness of God, we should be thankful. Not run from it, but thankful for his holiness. Because do you know what this means? We don't have to worry that your God will ever change. You don't have to ever worry that God will go back on his word. You can trust his promises. That means we can look at his word and know that what he says is true, and it will come to pass, and it will be true for us. You can stand on it. Friends, you can know that this God of the universe, who reigns over all and cares about what's going on and is establishing justice and equity, you can pray to him about anything. And it's because he's holy that matters. It's because he's holy that you can actually pray to God, and he is going to act in justice, and we can trust the way he's going to work. That's the God you worship this morning. Friends, as we end here today, I know it's very easy to get it backwards, but the holiness of God is a good thing. It's an attractive quality. It's one that we should long to go to him for. And because we are finite human beings and we are still sinners, there's always that tendency to switch it around, to make man higher than the God that created them. It's so easy to make the righteousness of man more important than the righteousness of God. And friends, I remember a man, his name is Paris Reedhead. He was a missionary in Africa. And he told the story about how he went out to Africa, and his main goal in Africa was to save these poor, terrible, these Africans who are in this poor, terrible life from having to spend eternity in hell. And that's a good motivation, by the way. I don't think it's a bad motivation. But he went out there, and guess what he discovered? That as he told people about this God, they already knew about him, and they didn't care. They knew about heaven. They didn't really want to go there. They didn't care. And he was so angry with God. God, why would you send me out here? I was telling these people of how they could know you and have this immeasurable gift. And he realized that day that he had flipped it upside down. He had said, these people, these poor people, deserve God's grace. When in reality, he was missing the fact that no one deserves God's grace. God's the one that deserves all glory. And our motivation changes then, not merely, by the way, I think you should seek to save sinners from hell. I think that's a good motivation. I don't think you should lose that. But his motivation changed, and he said something that rocked my world. It still does to this day. But he said, are you prepared to believe and follow this God, even if you go to hell at the end of the road? Because he's worthy of your worship. Now, friends, don't get me wrong. We don't have to choose one or the other. God offers us heaven when we deserve hell. And we should praise God for what he gives us in his grace. Forget not all his benefits. But friends, at the same time, there is another reason we should praise and worship God. Because God in all his holiness deserves all our worship. Because God in all his holiness is a good God. Why do you worship God this morning? Do you worship him because he is worthy and good and righteous? And friends, if you have never called on the person and work of Jesus Christ to save you today, call on him not merely because of the benefit, although you will get a great benefit out of that. Life from death. You'll get that. But also because he is the God of the universe. He is worthy of your worship. He's worthy of giving your life.